Good afternoon. I am Selva Demiralp, an economics professor at Koç University and the director of Koç University TÜSİAD Economic Research Forum, speaking to you from the Koç Holding headquarters in Istanbul. I want to welcome you all to our webinar. Today, we will discuss the costs of vaccine nationalism. The research that we will present makes a compelling case for global cooperation efforts to assure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Simultaneous translation is provided. If you would like to follow the event in Turkish, please click on the globe icon at the bottom right of your Zoom screen and choose Turkish. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Ömer Koç, the chairman of Koç Holding, for his opening remarks. Ömer Bey, I invite you to take the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I feel privileged to be delivering the opening speech of this important event. Today, we will have the chance of listening to very interesting findings of a recent report that has already become a global reference in the context of vaccine nationalism, clearly demonstrating its irrationality. I'm so proud to see faculty members of Koç University addressing and devastating global challenge and scientifically showing the right path to decision makers. I would like to thank the International Chamber of Commerce for funding this study. This report comes at a significant moment in time when the world stands at the crossroads of critical decisions related to global coordination of COVID-19 vaccinations. It is without a doubt that we are passing through an unprecedented period. Humanity has not suffered such extreme difficulties since World War II. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a global impact. No region, country, or individual has managed to continue life as before. The normal has changed. We're all concerned about the well-being of our loved ones and deeply saddened by the loss of more than 2.5 million lives worldwide. We also had to take very difficult professional decisions in the midst of huge uncertainties. Recent IMF calculations indicate that global output in 2020 was down by 3.5%. However, more importantly, the pandemic has not only manifested but also widened existing inequalities around the globe. Poor countries suffered the most, while richer economies were able to mobilize gigantic economic and social support mechanisms. The World Bank underlines that for the first time in 20 years, global poverty has significantly increased. Unfortunately, we now have around 120 million new poor people living under harsh conditions. All research studies attest to the fact that women had to bear more difficulties compared with men both at home and at the workplace. Moreover, according to UNICEF, almost 500 million students could not enjoy their fundamental right to education for a year, as they did not have the means to access broadcast or internet-based remote learning tools. It seems that we were not prepared for such a destructive challenge. However, the consequences might have been milder if governments had put a globally coordinated lockdown into place instead of taking isolated actions at the beginning. I think there could be no better description of the situation than the words of poet John Donne, which are in the preamble to the report. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. We need to understand the spirit of this 400-year-old message, which is now even more valid than at the time it was written. We must act accordingly. As the report concludes, no economy is an island either. The authors will shortly explain in detail the findings of their carefully structured study. They are analytically proving the very fact that no economy will fully recover until every recovers. I think their study removes the ifs and buts around the reality. Thanks to the unprecedented global collaboration of scientists, we now have nearly 200 vaccine candidates at different development stages. More than 10 candidates are already in phase 3 large-scale trials, and several have received emergency or limited authorization. According to the publicly available data, Advanced economies are far ahead in the global race to vaccinate their populations. By mid-February, high and upper middle income countries had secured 70% of the approved or potential vaccines with pre-purchase agreements. Low and lower middle income countries managed to sign for only 15%, while the remaining 15% goes to Global Vaccine Alliance COVAX. On the one hand, we have a country which has purchased enough to vaccinate its population 5 times over. On the other, many other countries which will mainly rely on the COVAX initiative. Moreover, low-income countries also face significant challenges in the distribution of the vaccines, like lack of cold chain capacities and accurate tracking systems for timely second doses. If the right measures are taken and the process of vaccination goes ahead equitably, then this virus will gradually be eradicated. However, our colleagues' study shows that while vaccination at home may help with domestic demand and supply shocks, all economies will underperform as long as their trading partners are not vaccinated. This is due to the integrated networks of global chains and markets, which are difficult to alter in the short run. Ironically, this study also finds that it will be the advanced economies bearing up to half of the economic losses. Equitable supply and distribution of vaccines is definitely a humanitarian responsibility. I do not want to sound too pessimistic about the altruistic sentiments of people, but events will show whether Homo sapiens will act rationally. This paper clearly demonstrates that providing equitable distribution of vaccines is not just a matter of charity. It is also about business rationality. In addition to this clear economic justification, governments should seriously consider the fact that without a fast and globally coordinated eradication of the virus, we will always be at the mercy of dangerous virus mutations, with its concomitant economic losses and social restrictions. Let's hope that common sense will prevail. We now have more reasons to be more hopeful. Recently, we were delighted at the selection of Ms. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, not only because she's the first woman and the first African to be nominated to such a post, but also because she chaired the leading global vaccination initiative, Gavi, for the last 5 years. Incidentally, she also highlighted the research report that will be discussed today. We must all help this experienced leader in her indefatigable fight against vaccine nationalism. The pandemic has accelerated strategic autonomy discussions in the West, which I personally approach with some caution. I hope these discussions do not evolve into rising walls of protectionism, undoing the accumulated benefits of globalization. It would be a pity as well as irrational to forego the efficiencies that have resulted from comparative advantages of different geographies. What will protect us from the effects of the next pandemic or similar shock? Which is more expensive, protectionism or better coordinated and sufficiently developed global response capacities? I'm sure experts will be pondering these problems. Despite their differences, even on some strategic choices, countries must still be able to discuss and cooperate on issues that affect the world as a whole. We must stand together. What the world needs is a better functioning multilateral governance system that can respond to new challenges. A pandemic requires a global response. So does climate change. Neither viruses nor greenhouse gases, heat waves, droughts, floods, or rising seas know anything about borders. So far, nations have performed even worse when it comes to this issue. We are all encouraged by the Green Deal initiative of the EU, the committed stance of the new US administration, and the positive messages from China. However, these policies should not lead to unilateral stipulations based mainly on commercial considerations and self-interest. Such an uncoordinated approach may exacerbate the existing inequalities and fail to deliver sufficient environmental results. Just as with the pandemic, we will need more dialogue, more determination, more coordination, and more burden sharing to successfully fight climate change. I want to conclude by reiterating my sincere wish that this pandemic will lead to some important changes and more rational planning and global cooperation. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Ömer Bey. It is our sincere wish that policymakers pay careful attention to the key messages that you have raised. At this point, I would like to hand over to Mr. Simone Kozlowski, the president of TÜSİAD, for his remarks. Simone Bey, if you would like to take the floor.
Yes. Dear friends, distinguished guests, the members of the business community.
You have to unmute yourself.
I am unmuted.
Okay, now we can hear you.
You can hear? Okay, good, great. So dear friends, distinguished guests, members of the business community and members of the press. It is an honor and great pleasure to host you here today. I would like to thank you all for your presence in our virtual event. It was December 19, 2019, when the coronavirus was first identified in Wuhan, China. From that date, we, the world, all have had an unprecedented experience in all the areas of our social lives. As of yesterday, global cases have reached 116 million, and more than 2.6 million deaths have been attributed to COVID-19. At the end of 2020, the authorization of the vaccines has taken place, and as of March 2021, 292 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered worldwide. We have witnessed an outstanding and coordinated effort on the discovery phase of the vaccine. As we all know, vaccines typically requires years of research and testing before reaching the clinic. But in 2020, scientists have embarked on a race to produce safe and effective coronavirus vaccines in a record time. It will be remembered as a remarkable success in the future. I would like to thank all the health workers and scientists one more time. Now we need the same effort for the distribution of the vaccines. This is a global crisis that requires consistent, coordinated, and fair global response. Firstly, this is essential for the health and well-being of the people. Along with that, it is also a matter of economic recovery. Although vaccine development and significant policy support lifted global economic activity in the third quarter of 2020, renewed waves of the new variants of the virus are still threatening the global recovery. We are now closely watching when herd immunity may be achieved, not just in advanced economies, but worldwide. The equal distribution of vaccines will be the key determinant of a synchronized and healthy global economic growth going forward. We should be mindful that all countries in a globalized world are highly interdependent. Governments are under pressure to rapidly vaccinate the population and to support industry to increase the manufacturing capacities of vaccines. It is important that governments act collaboratively to help ensure equitable distribution of vaccines around the world, including to the most vulnerable populations. Nevertheless, initiatives like the recent EU regulation requiring export authorization for COVID-19 vaccines and related inputs is a concern in this context. Both the EU business world and major business associations from G20 countries, including TÜSİAD, drew attention on the difficulties that may be caused by such restrictive measures and have emphasized the importance of global distribution of the vaccine as well as resilience of the global supply chains. Today, we will gain valuable insight about the economic cost of inequitable vaccine distribution. I would like to congratulate Professor Demiralp and the other contributors for this important work. The study contains extremely important findings as it relates to economic burden. Economic welfare depends on strong healthcare systems and healthy individuals. Dear guests, it is exciting to host the contributors of the research and listen to their study here today. I would like to thank the research team once again for their contributions and also ICC for their support. It is an honor to be a part of this global effort. We strongly believe that global coordination is crucial in the fight against this pandemic. Thank you very much once again for your participation. I wish you all a successful...
Thank you, Simone Bey, for your kind words on behalf of all my co-authors. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Mr. Arnaud Bernard from the World Economic Forum. Mr. Bernard is the head of Shaping the Future of Health and Healthcare platform at the World Economic Forum. Mr. Bernard, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, dear friends at Koch University, for welcoming me today. And I would like to cover a few dimensions of the current crisis, which obviously has an economic burden that you have been able to quantify, and that's quite a defining report you produced. So again, congratulations on doing that. How can we avoid that this nightmare scenario you explain would happen? This is where I would like to focus. And the first thing is COVAX. As we well know, COVAX at this point in time received approximately $10 billion in funding, in a total of 30 billion that they would need to cover low and middle income countries at full scale until herd immunity. Let's keep in mind that 2 billion doses that COVAX will supply to low and middle income countries actually will cover only 20% of the populations. That's important because obviously the most vulnerable would not need to be getting to hospitals. I mean, the fatality rate would considerably decrease. But in the meantime, the propagation and circulation of the virus would continue because not all of the population would have been vaccinated, and we would be far from herd immunity. In that scenario, there is something that could happen, is that actually more variants would develop, and then you get again in that situation where hospitals get saturated and health systems that are strained becomes the bottleneck. I want to insist on that. Beyond the economic cost, there is another cost that is fairly important to mention. Think about the fact that for every 1 month of a delay of a diagnosis of a cancer patient, depending on the cancer, we see a 7 to 13% decrease in survival. That's in a context where in the current period, we've seen that for colorectal cancer or breast cancer in 8 developed countries, diagnosis rates have fallen by a number of more than 50%. When you cross the two numbers and you think about 10 million people dying from cancer every year, just 10% increase in that mortality rate would mean 20 million healthy, productive lives years. That's 500 billion. That's just cancer. That's just cancer. Think about the malaria cases that are not treated, the TB cases that have not been diagnosed because those instruments are used for COVID, hepatitis, diabetes. I think the 500 billion would be multiplied by a factor of 2, 3, 4, God knows. And that may be very close to the toll you mentioned in the first place from international trade reduction. So I think that would be also an interesting survey. So what needs to happen? Point number one, we need to find those variants. Beyond COVAX, we need to find those variants very, very fast. We need to surveil and genomics and do next generation sequencing on positive cases in a more larger scale than it is done today. I think about 20% of those cases receiving full genome sequence in the UK, 50% in Denmark, 0.9% in the US. So that's the first opportunity, increasing genomic surveillance. And then I would like to mention that tomorrow, CEPI will host the very beginning of a replenishment campaign that will culminate with a fundraising in the fall. CEPI is willing to advance a manufacturing alliance that would be put at work in 20 classes of viruses where there is currently no vaccines. We have been lucky this time. We knew the coronavirus quite well because of SARS-1 and because of MERS. Now think about a category of virus class where we know very little, such as West Nile virus, for instance. We would not be able to deliver a vaccine in a period of 1 year. That's the opportunity, enabling a manufacturing alliance that would advance vaccine against prototype pathogens in 25 classes of virus where no vaccines do exist. Over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bernard. Our study was commissioned by the Research Foundation of the International Chamber of Commerce. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Mr. John Denton, the Secretary General of the ICC, to share his remarks. Mr. Denton, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be with you all today. I'm sorry that I can't be in Istanbul. I'm actually, you would know, I'm actually an investor in Turkey and a part of the consortium that owns the port of Mersin, so I have a huge interest in the success of the Turkish economy. But first of all, I'd like to thank Ömer Koç for his very eloquent words, the chairman of Mr. Koç, for your kind invitation to speak today. I'd also like to thank Koç University, TÜSİAD, and the Economic Research Forum, not only for the invitation, but more importantly for the vision in putting together this webinar on what is the most important and pressing issue that we're confronting at the moment. And while I'm here today, I want to express my deep gratitude and admiration for the fine, outstanding work of the 5 outstanding economic researchers, Sim Şakmali, Selva Demirat, Şebnem Kalemi Ojkan, Sevkan Yesiltaş, and Muhammad Ali Yildirim, whose collective intellectual firepower has over the last month or so, I think, palpably shifted the global debate on the fight against COVID-19. As many of you would know, the International Chamber of Commerce, of which I'm proud to be the Secretary General, the World Business Organization, the institutional representative of the global real economy, commissioned this important study, which was carried out by these very authors that added to the already extremely compelling public health reasons for global vaccination through a first-class economic analysis. It's much better for you to hear from them about the details. So let me instead make 3 political points by way of context. First, the economic case for global vaccinations has only become more compelling. At ICC, we had intuited for some time that no economy will recover until every economy recovers. Now we have the proof. And not only that, the data shows that the bulk of the costs will ultimately be borne by advanced economies. This is a really important insight drawn from this important study. As we have explained repeatedly to finance ministers, international policymakers, this means that funding a truly global and equitable vaccination program is actually the best domestic stimulus measure a government can take. International cooperation, often couched in moral terms like equity and solidarity, is not just a nice to have, but a must have to save businesses, especially SMEs, to ensure a return to economic growth and to get trade moving again. Additionally, since the pandemic began, quite understandably, the most compelling reasons for fighting COVID-19 have been based on health considerations, minimizing needless deaths, avoiding overcrowding hospital systems, protecting people. But as the economic damage has mounted and millions of businesses have closed, and the risks of long-term economic damage increased, the economic imperative for action has only accelerated. Now, with new variants emerging, failure to fully fund COVAX, and with some governments imposing dangerous export restrictions already, we are at a critical juncture. We urgently need the economic case for global vaccination to be understood in the halls of power. And that means people like you, economists, researchers, intellectuals, businesses, industry associations, you must play a catalytic role in persuading governments to do what is required to bring the pandemic to an orderly close so that we can get back to life and back to business. Secondly, governments have the pandemic exit strategy ready. They just need to execute it. In many ways, COVID-19 ushered in an unprecedented level of global public-private cooperation, as novel as the virus itself. Chief among the international community's achievements was the creation of COVAX, the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, the multilateral public-private initiative for research, manufacture, and distribution of tests, treatments, and vaccines on a global and equitable basis. COVAX, of course, is a key element of this structure, and if successful, will allow vaccination of 20% of the world's population by the end of this year. Not enough to achieve herd immunity, but enough to protect healthcare workers and the most vulnerable everywhere in the world, irrespective of wealth, and enough to drastically reduce the chances of more mutant strains emerging. The problem is that all elements are drastically underfunded. There remains a $25 billion funding gap, which for months governments have promised to fill but have not delivered on. As economists, you naturally look not just at costs, but at benefits and opportunity costs. And what we know is that 25 billion may, at first blush, appear like an expensive public health bill. But the reality is that it will provide an extraordinary rate of return. As the authors from Koch and Maryland University so persuasively show, the cost to the global economy of not vaccinating the world could be as high as $9.2 trillion. A back-of-the-envelope calculation shows that fully funding Act A could yield as high a return as 166 times every dollar invested. So purchasing vaccines for the developing world is not an act of generosity. It's an essential investment for governments if they want to revive their domestic economies. Thirdly, we can and we must scale up public-private cooperation. In February, Dr. Tedros and I convened over 100 senior business leaders globally to educate them about the importance of Act A, which really is in many ways the most remarkable instance of public-private cooperation the world has seen. During that meeting, it became clear that there are so many ways the private sector can contribute more to the pandemic response, not just in terms of financing, where the private sector has already contributed around 800 million of the 1.5 billion it might reasonably expect it to contribute, but perhaps more importantly, through partnership, especially on the complex logistical challenges of vaccine delivery, data collection, building effective surveillance systems, and creating the innovative tools we need to fight COVID. Crucially, unleashing that innovation requires a willingness on the part of governments to engage with the private sector. That's why groupings like this, businesses, associations, economists, are so important. So let me conclude. It is clear, and you will hear precisely why during this webinar, that the economic imperative for global vaccinations is enormous and getting stronger by the day. But we also live in a world of political realities, where economic logic does not, unfortunately, always hold sway, where politicians are tempted into wrong-headed policies like imposing export restrictions, as we've seen recently by the Italian government, and we're urgently urging others not to follow, and which might be politically expedient in the short term, but run the risk of retaliatory measures wreaking havoc on precarious COVID-19 vaccine supply chains, creating artificial bottlenecks, spoiling vaccines, and undermining production plans, let alone the damage they do to the international goodwill and cooperation required to maintain an effective multilateral trading system. So it is essential that we get the economic case out there, that politicians understand it, that they understand that there is a strong business constituency behind it too. That hopefully will compel them to act in a way that not only saves lives, but saves livelihoods. That is the spirit of the International Chamber of Commerce, and that is the message we bring to you today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Denton. I would like to thank all our speakers for their invaluable contributions. Their support is critical in raising awareness on the issue and facilitating global coordination. We will now move on to present our research on the costs of inequitable access to vaccines. "2020 was an extraordinary year where the entire world watched how the COVID-19 pandemic devastated our lives and livelihoods. What started as a remote epidemic in China soon took over our lives. It's changed the way we work, it's changed the way we socialize, it changed the way we educate our children. The fear factor trapped us in our homes as we tried to minimize our exposure to the virus. In fact, the world acted in accordance with the wisdom that was expressed by William Shakespeare in the 17th century, that the best safety lies in fear. Perhaps the best news in 2020 was the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. Vaccines can be a game changer by containing the pandemic in a given country. However, it was soon realized that the capacity to manufacture and distribute enough doses of vaccines to inoculate the world population in a timely manner is far from being sufficient. The vaccine shortage triggered the so-called vaccine nationalism. Vaccine nationalism occurs when countries sign agreements with the vaccine manufacturers in order to secure enough doses of vaccines for their own populations before they become available elsewhere in the world. And in this chart taken from our World in Data, we can see the extent of vaccine nationalism. The darker shades of blue illustrate more intensive vaccine rollouts. And the uneven color code that we can see in this map illustrates that there is a serious inequitable distribution of vaccines in the world as we speak. Vaccine nationalism is clearly a global threat, but ironically, it is also a threat for the very countries who adopt such behavior. There are health costs, political costs, and economic costs associated with vaccine nationalism. What are the health costs? Well, we know that the more the virus replicates, the more opportunities it has to mutate, as in the case of UK and South African variants. And with the revival of international travel, these new strains of virus will circulate around the world. And the countries who vaccinate themselves should realize that by contributing to efforts to vaccinate other countries, they will be protecting themselves because the mutations risk the efficacy of existing vaccines. There are also political costs associated with vaccine nationalism. In the era of a deadly pandemic, one can imagine that offering vaccines to the less privileged countries is one of the strongest weapons that you can have. Indeed, both China and Russia increased their overall standing and influence in the region by offering vaccines. So the countries should once again be aware of the fact that by contributing to global efforts to make vaccines available, they will be contributing to global community and global re-engagement. Not least, vaccine nationalism also has significant economic costs, which is the focus of our study. The countries who adopt vaccine nationalism are going to suffer from the disruptions in their trade linkages with their unvaccinated partners. I think there's with the slideshow, so I'm going to, okay, there it is. So the global shortage of vaccines and the consequent vaccine nationalism, which made everything even worse, led the World Health Organization, Gavi, CEPI, and other organizations to put together the ACT, Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Program. The idea is to bring together vaccine manufacturers, scientists, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector in order to provide solutions to eliminate the pandemic as soon as possible. And COVAX is the vaccine pillar, as we heard from our opening remarks as well. COVAX aims to manufacture 2 billion doses of vaccines in order to inoculate 20% of the world population in 2021. And the estimated costs of this program is $38 billion. However, so far, only about $11 billion is accumulated. The evident reluctance of the rich countries in contributing to COVAX reflects their focus on domestic economic recovery. And this is exactly where our research steps in. We calculate the global economic costs of inequitable distribution of vaccines, and we illustrate that rich countries would have to bear significant costs in the absence of equitable vaccine availability. We provide an eye-opening message to the global community. We compare the costs of uneven vaccine distribution against the costs of manufacturing and distributing vaccines. And we illustrate that investing in cooperative efforts to manufacture more vaccines is well worth the costs. Because on the one hand, we are talking about $38 billion that is needed to inoculate 20% of the world population. On the other hand, in the absence of vaccine distribution or equitable vaccine distribution, we are talking about billions and trillions of dollars that will be borne by those countries who already have access to vaccines. So our message is rather clear. It is not an act of charity, but an act of economic rationality to contribute to efforts such as COVAX. At this point, I should highlight that we provide an academic framework, and there are still mounting uncertainties regarding the course of the pandemic. Every day we hear something new, either regarding the mutations or the acceleration or the slowdown of the number of cases, which may require new lockdowns. So in the presence of all these uncertainties, it's rather difficult to see what lies ahead of us. So to overcome these challenges, we adopt an academic approach with certain assumptions. And these assumptions allow us to provide a range of scenarios which provide an estimate for the potential costs of inequitable vaccine distribution. What are the drivers of these costs? Well, given the global interdependencies between countries, even if a country achieves universal vaccination of its citizens, that country may still suffer economic costs if the rest of the world is not vaccinated. Your exports to unvaccinated countries go down, and your imports from unvaccinated countries go down. Why is that? Because if your trade partners are still suffering from the pandemic, their income level is going to come down, and they won't be able to demand as many goods and services from you. In addition, again, if the pandemic is still at full force in your trade partners, there are going to be lockdowns, people will get sick and won't be able to report to work. So they won't be able to produce those goods and services you used to buy from them. And in particular, if we focus on imports of intermediate goods, these are the goods that you use in order to produce final goods, then your production of final goods and services is going to come down as well. To give an example, let's say India produces steel and exports to Turkey. Turkey uses that steel and manufactures appliance parts and exports to Germany, and Germany uses those appliance parts to manufacture refrigerators. If the pandemic is still going on in India, people get sick, cannot go to work, there are lockdowns, then India's steel production goes down. In effect, Turkey buys less steel from India and will be able to manufacture less appliance parts. In return, Germany will be able to buy less appliance parts from Turkey and manufacture less refrigerators. So these global value chains, which we assume to be fixed in the short run, is going to amplify the overall costs of the pandemic, in addition to the demand channel that feeds in through the exports. So if I give you an example of the costs under what we think is a realistic scenario, assuming that advanced economies are vaccinated within the first half of 2021, and only half of the populations of lower income countries are vaccinated by the end of 2021, we estimate total global costs to be as high as $3.8 trillion. And more strikingly, up to 50% of these costs might be borne by the vaccinated countries. And if the conditions get worse and the conditions become more binding and the supply chain disruptions become more strict, then the costs may go up to $9 trillion, as it was pronounced by Mr. Denton. Let me wrap up before I leave the floor to my co-authors. Our preamble in the paper is a touchy quote by the English poet John Donne, that no man is an island, as it was eloquently highlighted by Ömer Bey. By drawing attention to funeral bells, John Donne internalizes the suffering from the death of other people. And in this paper, we generalize this idea to the economies and note that no economy is an island. The economic suffering in one country due to the pandemic affects the growth prospects of another country. The pandemic taught us an important lesson, which is the fact that the recovery of the more privileged countries is dependent upon the recovery of the less privileged countries. So a collective action is a must. The pandemic was a miserable time period. Millions of people died, many more got sick, and many of us billions of people were just contained in their homes in order to minimize our exposure to the virus. And here you see my little one who spent more than a year behind the walls and helped mommy prepare this presentation. She is literally counting the days for the pandemic to be over, which is heartbreaking. But today we are not here to make you sad. We are actually very hopeful because we think that the solution for our way out of the pandemic aligns with the economic incentives. A global perspective is what is needed. And although we are well aware of the fact that it is primarily a moral responsibility to provide equitable distribution of vaccines, when moral incentives are not strong enough to bring the world into action, we think that highlighting the economic incentives might do the trick and facilitate the efforts to contribute to global vaccine production. At this point, I would like to leave the floor to my co-author, Muhammed Ali Yildirim, who is going to present the model.
Thank you, Selva, for the great introduction. So I will talk about the model and how we estimate the economic cost of this inequitable vaccination. And let me start with how we do the modeling. So we model the economy as composed of sectors, and this sectoral composition from agriculture to airline industry to car industry will be the basis for our analysis. And when we do this, of course, this will affect the pandemic, because pandemic being passed from people to people will be affected by the sectoral heterogeneity of the countries. Then pandemic in turn will affect the labor shocks, and which will create a supply shock, and also a demand shock where consumers alter the spending. So let me first focus on how we model the pandemic given the sectoral heterogeneity, and give you how the epidemiologists approach this infection dynamics. And this is where we borrow this model, SIR model. It comes from the acronyms of these words, susceptible, infected, and recovered, that epidemiologists use to model different pandemics. So in part, in this model, society is divided into three groups. The first group being susceptible people. These are people who haven't developed immunity yet. These are the people who are in the danger of contracting the disease from the infected people. How does this happen? And let me go back to the slide, maybe. Okay. So these people, susceptible people, get in contact with the infected people, and then they become infected themselves. And all the measures like the masks, hygiene, social distancing, school closing, we try to eliminate or limit this interaction between infected people and susceptible people. So this is how people get infected. But then with the healthcare and drugs and with other like ICUs, intensive care units and so forth, we try to give a better care for the infected people and hopefully have them recovered. Vaccines, they will help people develop immunity. So they directly transfer susceptible people to the recovered people. So then they are not in danger of being infected. So this is the basic underlying idea. And how are we going to interact this with sectoral heterogeneity? Basically, we will look at how different sectors occupy different occupations, and we will focus on the occupational characteristics. What type of occupational characteristics? The first one that we often use is the teleworkability, because some of the occupations like ours, all this research has been done over Zoom. We had countless Zoom meetings throughout the last year. Actually, this is the first time that we are in the same room since the beginning of the pandemic, since last year, that we came together physically. So all our work was teleworkable. We were among the occupations that were teleworkable, but there are some occupations that need to be done on site, like the factory workers and so forth, right? So in terms of pandemic, what does this imply? It implies that the people who are teleworkable can isolate themselves easier from the other people, so they will have a lower infection rate, whereas the people on site, they are more exposed in the danger of getting infected. But among on-site people, there's also some variation. Like the people, farmers, they are on-site, but they don't need to be close to the other people, so they have low proximity. Whereas if you're a hairdresser or a dentist or a nurse, then you need to be high proximity with people. And this proximity also results in a higher infection rate. Whereas if you're in a low proximity occupation, you will have lower infection rate. So combining these two dimensions, teleworkability and proximity, we can proxy for the infection rates in different industries, which will help us understand the infection dynamics better. In particular, in this graph, we show all the 36 different industries and how they differ in terms of their teleworkability and proximity. Teleworkable shares are shown in the purple bars. Proximity is shown in the navy bars. Let me focus on two industries. It's a little complicated on this figure. So here I show the IT industry, for instance. More than 80% of the people in the IT industry have occupations that are teleworkable. So they can do their jobs in remote locations. And the rest who requires proximity, like the people who need to physically put the wires and do other jobs, they require medium level of proximity. But if you look at the healthcare industry, the relatively lower share is teleworkable. So these could be scientists and other data analysis people who work in the healthcare industry. But those people who go on site need to be in very close proximity with people. So they're in danger of contracting the disease at much higher rates. And this is evident in our heroes, the doctors and the nurses and all the healthcare workers that work, that lead the fight against the pandemic. So given this, you see how sectoral heterogeneity occurs in the infection rates, right? And this in turn translates into supply shocks. How? Because people, when they contract the disease, workers, they're unable to work. That's supply shock number one. So if I'm sick, I don't go to work, then my output gets diminished. But on top, even more severe supply shock occurs when there are lockdowns. So when people, all the non-essential workers are required to stay at home because of very high levels of pandemic, we have lockdowns, right? And this creates even a massive labor shock for an industry. And how do we determine these lockdowns? Basically, in our models, we generated a database of ICU capacities of all countries. And we said a lockdown will occur if the ICU capacity for a country is not sufficient enough to care for the most sick in the among the people. So this gives our supply shock in terms of labor. But as Selva alluded to in her opening remarks, for instance, Indian steel goes to Turkey, Turkish appliance then becomes Turkish appliance parts, and that goes to Germany. We can do it for many different industries. And here I'm showing the car industry. So car industry requires many different parts, hundreds or thousands of different parts. I'm just showing several of them as an illustrative purposes. And these inputs are combined together to make this output, which is an automobile. So when there's a supply shock, like people cannot go to work, one of those industries gets affected. And nowadays we see this, for instance, in the semiconductor chips, right? So semiconductor chips are limited as an input, which disrupts the automotive industry. So this is very similar to our story, semiconductor chips in Taiwan, resulting in automotive disruptions here in Turkey, in the Koç Group, and all over the world. But this automobile could be German automobiles, Turkish automobiles, US automobiles. These inputs can come from multitude of countries. In essence, this creates a huge network, a massive network of industries being connected together, which we call the input-output linkages. Let me show you two different instances of this input-output linkages. On the left-hand side, we show the trade relationships between the countries. So this could be intermediate inputs, this could be final inputs, and so forth. And on the right-hand side, I show the inter-industry relationships between these networks. So in reality, the network that we use is a combination of these two and much larger, but this is for illustrative purposes. Let me focus on the country side. In the country network, the size of the nodes represent the GDP of the country. US is a large node, China is a large node. Then we show the vaccinated countries with black borders around them. And the connections between the countries show trade relationships between these countries. And the shade of the blue that labels the country represent how open that country is to trade. So it's basically imports plus exports over its GDP. As you see, like from our quote from the beginning, no man is an island. Here, no country is an island, and every country is connected to each other. On the right-hand side, we depict the industry part. And again, the size of the industry is proportional to the output size. The color is related to the share of inputs coming from unvaccinated countries from left. And we combine the most significant links on this network as well. And again, what you see is everything is connected to each other, even though we are showing only the most significant connections. And especially, there are some industries on top which are related to manufacturing, and bottom more are service sector related. And an industry like basic metals feeds, like in Selvas example, India still feeds into many different industries. Okay, so this tells us the supply side of the story, this huge international input-output linkages. On the other hand, this shock that we experienced during pandemic is not just a supply shock. We all know it created a huge demand shock. Most of our expenditures changed during this supply. And this expenditure changes were also sectoral, sector dependent. How did this why did this expenditure change? Because of fear factor. We were in fear of contracting the disease. We were in fear of transmitting the disease. We were in fear of losing our jobs and so forth. And also, we had huge uncertainty ahead of us. We didn't know when the recovery would come. We didn't know when we would be safe against the disease and so forth. And this created expenditure change. And in our model, we relate this expenditure change to level of infections. So the level of infections, when it's higher, we see the most major, the heaviest change. When it's lower, the simplest change. What kind of sectoral heterogeneity does this demand change have? Like, for instance, industries like accommodation, restaurants, food services, airline, we saw a huge decline in their consumption. On the other hand, there were some industries like online shopping, groceries, and so forth that thrived through the pandemic. We pinned down this data by looking at the credit card expenditures of people. And when we don't see a clear relationship with the credit card data, we supplement it with the industry reports. And this is how we pin down the demand changes. And this, importantly, our work both incorporates the domestic demand and also the international demand. So even when Turkey when India is suffering through the pandemic, its demand for German cars will decline, and we will see that in our demand changes. Okay, so at this point, I want to give the floor to Dr. Cem Çakmaklı to present our data and findings in more detail based on this model that we set up.
Thank you, Mohammed, for providing details. Now I'm going to talk about the data that we have used for estimating this cost, and I'm going to talk about our findings that we estimate for economic costs in the world and among due to inequitable vaccine distribution. So as Mohammed provided details about our model structure, our model relies on two important pillars. The first pillar is the epidemiological model that we model the trajectory of the pandemic. So as we all know, all countries had different experiences about the pandemic. Some could control the pandemic quite well. Some could not able to contain the pandemic at all. Some were hit quite forcefully. So for taking these country-specific differences, country-specific heterogeneity into account, we use actual data that we have, actual daily data that we observed throughout 2020. So we use country-specific daily data on the COVID-19 pandemic from Johns Hopkins University Data Repository, which is the main center of the data about the pandemic. And we use number of active infections in each country to take these country-specific differences about the course of the pandemic into account. And furthermore, we then transform these country-specific differences in terms of the trajectory of the pandemic throughout the sectors using our modeling framework. By doing that, we were able to get a very clear high-definition picture of the trajectory of the pandemic and country-specific infection dynamics. And taking the picture, taking the data from the end of the December 2020, about the pandemic and the country-specific differences about the trajectory of the pandemic, we predicted the course of the pandemic in each country under different vaccination scenarios. So in that sense, we conjecture the course of the pandemic in each country in our data set and more in each sector in these countries under different vaccination scenarios. So first, we have a picture about how the pandemic will evolve over the year ahead. And the second pillar in our modeling framework is the world production base. So for this, we use the input-output tables provided by OECD, inter-country, inter-industry input-output tables that provides us a very high resolution, a very clear picture about the world production base, about countries, about in which sectors countries have produced, about which sectors trade with which sectors internationally, about what are the trade linkages, what are the supply chains, how are the international production networks at the pre-pandemic level. So this provides a very rich data set giving the inputs, intermediate goods that the sectors are using, how much they import, how much they export, what are the value added created in each sector, in each country, in each of the 65 countries that we consider, in each 36 industries in these countries that we consider, and finally the output that were produced in these countries at the pre-pandemic level. So by gathering this conjecture about the trajectory of the pandemic in high definition in each country and sectors, together with this economic data, high definition economic data, we were able to compute the economic costs under different vaccination scenarios at the world level, at the country level, and further at the industry level. So let me talk about which scenarios that we consider about vaccination, which is the central point of our paper. So we consider worst case scenarios, we consider best case scenarios, but here I'm going to talk about what we call as more realistic scenario. So under this realistic scenario, we assume that the high income countries, advanced economies, they can inoculate the full population by mid-2021. So they have access to vaccination fully. They are able to inoculate full population in a short time. The remaining countries, the low income countries, however, they only have partial access to vaccination. So they could inoculate only half of the population, and this they can do by end of 2021. So there are differences in terms of which portion of the population have access to vaccination and in how much time they can inoculate this population. We further assume that if at some point of the pandemic, if the countries are hit quite fiercely such that the number of severe infections exceed the ICU capacity of each countries, and we use actual ICU capacity data for each of the country we obtain from different sources, then these countries impose lockdowns of 2 weeks to contain the pandemic and to prevent the infection. So under these scenarios, under these vaccination scenarios, and given this high resolution picture of the pandemic and the world production base, the cost that we compute is $3.8 trillion for all the world. This is due to inequitable vaccine distribution. And the key finding, the most striking finding that we have is that half of this cost borne by high-income countries. So note that these high-income countries have full access to vaccination. They can inoculate all the population in a short time, but still they bear up almost half of they are incurred by almost half of the costs that we compute for the world. So $1.9 trillion for these high-income countries. So when we compute this cost, there are two forces kicking in. The first, the demand channel. So the low-income countries, they will not be able to contain the pandemic, so the demand will reduce. But not only domestic demand, but also the international demand will reduce. So that will cause a reduction in the exports of high-income countries. So that's one source of the cost. And the second source of the cost is the supply channel. So since the pandemic could not be contained in this low-income countries, they will not be able to make the production of the intermediate goods required for the production of the high-income countries. So the supply chains will be disrupted. So the international production networks will be malfunctioning. So therefore, the high-income countries will not be able to produce, and they will incur this second part by this second part of the cost. Indeed, if we just cut the second part, indeed, if we assume that if the international production network still will work properly, there will be no supply chain disruptions, then this cost for the high-income countries will reduce to $400 billion. And as a result of this, the cost for the world will be reducing to $1.8 trillion. So this $400 billion is still huge. If you think that for the COVAX initiative, the funds that are required is only $38 billion. This cost that we computed, if only one channel operates, is tenfold of this fund that is required for this COVAX initiative. So this is the picture that we have at the world level and at the country group level, high income and low income countries. But let me give you some more information about how this cost is distributed across the world. So this is a picture, this is a world map with all the countries with different colors, quite a colorful world map. And the colors indicate the cost that individual countries will incur. The light colors indicate low levels of cost, low levels around like 100 billion or 50 billion dollars. And dark colors, the more orange, the more reddish colors indicate higher level of the cost, around like 500, 600 billions of dollars. So here, we only let the first channel operates, the demand channel operates. This is the costs are due to the reduction in the exports of high-income countries to the low-income countries. So the international production networks work properly in this case. So in this case, we can see that there is a very clear distinction between the yellow and between the reddish colors. So that basically provides us the our computations in the previous slide. So there is a clear distinction between high income and low income countries in terms of bearing this cost, but still the costs are high for the income countries as well. But when we let the international production networks to operate, then these colors come very close for both of the country groups, for high income and for low income countries. So in this case, when the international production networks operate, so when there are supply chain disruptions, when the high-income countries are not able to acquire the intermediate goods that they need for their production from the low-income countries, then their cost will increase enormously. In this case, the cost of individual countries are like 5 or 6-fold of the previous case, the cost that we compute for the previous case, and that's why the colors are coming together. So the colors of high-income countries are also becoming darker shaded. So they are close to low income countries. So that's why the costs are incurred halfly by high income and halfly by low income countries due to inequitable vaccine distribution. So we provide the costs at the world level and we provide the costs at the country level, but our high definition pictures, so our detailed model also let us to provide costs at the sectoral level. So I pass the floor to Dr. Sevcan Yeşiltaş for giving the information about our estimates at sectoral level.
All right. Thanks, Cem and Muhammed, for the detailed discussion of our model through which we estimated economic cost of inequitable vaccination by combining sectoral heterogeneity on infection dynamics and sectoral heterogeneity in terms of international trade and production networks. As my colleagues mentioned before, we estimated those economic sector level so that sectoral aggregates give us the country level economic cost that Cem presented just before by referring to the pie charts and world maps. And now, as a follow-up to the presentation of our findings, I would like to talk about sector-level economic cost in order to show you the heterogeneous impact of this pandemic on different sectors. Before jumping into the details, let me give you the main takeaway very quickly. countries and sectors that have stronger linkages with their unvaccinated trade partners are found to be hit harder by this pandemic, which goes in line with the predictions that Mohammed made based on the country level and sector level network charts. Well, to show you the extent of counter-sector heterogeneity in terms of economic cost, we make use of horizontal box plots for the distribution of sector-level economic cost measured by GDP losses in percentages at one-digit sector level for both types of countries. On the left panel, we show you the distribution of sector-level economic cost among the vaccinated advanced economies. Similarly, on the right panel, we show you the distribution of the sector-level economic cost among the unvaccinated emerging market and developing economies. And among 16 one-digit sector, we choose two representative sectors in order to give you a flavor of our findings that tradable and non-tradable sectors suffer differently in terms of economic costs in both country groups. And here sectors are color-coded that blue color refers to tradable sectors like manufacturing industry, whereas pink color refers to non-tradable sectors like accommodation and food. And also here, with the small vertical black line, the maximum GDP loss of advanced economies from the left panel on the right panel, we want to highlight the scale differences in terms of sector level economic cost between these two country groups. Having these details in mind, we extend this horizontal box plot representation by including all 16 one-digit sectors, and we plot sector level economic cost ranked from the lowest to the highest for both country groups, considering our realistic scenario that advanced economies vaccinate their entire population by the mid of 2021, whereas emerging market and developing economies vaccinate only half of their population. And on the right panel, among the non-vaccinated emerging market and developing countries, the ranking we see is the very typical one that we used to see throughout 2020. We have seen how services sector collapsed in the world because people didn't consume services because they with the worry of getting infected. And so here at the bottom, it is because the emerging market countries are not able to fully vaccinate their population. So in the bottom, we see accommodation and food services, real estate sector, and arts and entertainment are the sectors that have the highest sectoral cost. But we also see that the vertical small black line shows you the maximum GDP loss in advanced economies in those countries. Why this is the case? If you go to the left panel, we see that these services sector don't suffer anymore in advanced economies. Why this is the case? Because advanced economies, thanks to the universal vaccination within their borders, they managed to fully contain the spread of virus within their borders, and domestic costs are fully eliminated. In fact, in advanced economies, they suffer because of tradable sectors. For example, in here, the maximum GDP loss we observe is taking place, which is shown with blue, in terms of agriculture and fishing. And among vaccinated advanced economies, as we expected, tradable sector cost is found to be highly correlated with the degree of openness. For example, Netherlands is more open to trade compared to the United States, so tradable sector in Netherlands suffer more than US does. In fact, it doesn't mean that advanced economies only suffer in terms of tradable sector. As we see here, there are two non-tradable sectors like wholesale and retail and transportation and storage. These are the sectors that have stronger trade linkages with unvaccinated emerging markets and developing economies that work through both export and import channels. And so because of these trade linkages, we see that these sectors also suffer a lot in advanced economies, because these non-tradable sectors either import intermediate inputs from those unvaccinated emerging market and developing economies, or they are linked to other domestic sectors that import intermediate inputs from non-vaccinated emerging markets and developing countries. So here, to wrap up, this detailed picture shows us that ongoing pandemic in unvaccinated emerging market and developing economies can still have three effects on vaccinated advanced economies, thanks to the amplification mechanism of the global supply chains. All right, so as my colleagues mentioned before, we produce estimates based on a forward-looking exercise that considers potential global supply disruptions in 2021. Our modeling framework assumes that global supply chains are fixed in the short run with fixed prices, so it is rather difficult for us to change them either through labor reallocation or through a substitution between intermediate goods. We think that these assumptions are realistic given the mounting uncertainty ahead of us regarding the vaccination rollout, uncertainty regarding the course of pandemic, as well as potential on and off lockdowns. And in fact, recent news hints some potential supply chain disruptions in 2021. For example, anecdotal evidence based on recent news reflects the global shortage of some important types of intermediate goods like semiconductor chips that are mainly used in the car production, as Mohammed mentioned before. Also, the shortage of skilled workers that were unfortunately out of labor force during the lockdowns of 2020. And this suggests that supply chain disruptions may have a lagged effect on production. It is because production may not start as smoothly as expected after the repeated periods of lockdowns that many countries in the world had to implement in order to contain the spread of the virus within their borders. And recently we read a very interesting news that Taiwan wants to use her well-established trade relationships with Germany as a leverage to facilitate her access to COVID-19 vaccines, which truly goes in line with our message that global coordination is required in terms of vaccine distribution for a sustainable global recovery, because we know that no economy can fully recover until we have a truly equal vaccine distribution across the globe. On the other hand, we observe some mitigated global supply chain disruptions in 2020. It might be the case either lockdowns were not that extended, or companies ended up with huge amounts of inventories following the dramatic decline in overall demand during the pandemic, and they used those inventories in order to support their operations in 2020. So in order to provide a supportive evidence, we make use of PMI data on inventories. Focusing on the manufacturing industry, we plot the pattern of inventories over time, and we see a very remarkable downward trend throughout the 2020, which goes in line with the available survey-based evidence that firms use inventories in order to adjust their operations, and in fact they expect moderate to severe impacts on their operations towards the end of 2020. Lastly, in order to better understand the role of inventory adjustment of the firms that might have mitigated the effect of supply constraints during the pandemic, we conducted a very trivial empirical analysis using the same PMI manufacturing data. And our findings show that there is a significant and positive relationship between the inventories and new orders before the pandemic hit the world. So it gives suggests the supportive evidence for the pro-cyclical behavior of inventory investments, such that during normal times, if there is no supply shock, as demand rises, firms continue production and they pile up on inventories. And for the pandemic periods, we see that inventories indeed go down, which goes in line with the downward trend that I showed you in my previous slide. And also our findings provide evidence for the counter-cyclical behavior of the inventory investments in the months that the COVID-19 hit the world. And in the months where overall demand is really low, if there is supply shock, we see that as demand goes down, inventories accumulate. If demand is back to normal, then companies lower their inventories. So to wrap up, if the pandemic goes on, there are many challenges ahead of us regarding the vaccination rollout, and there are many unknowns regarding the course of pandemic. So we expect this mitigating effect of inventories to disappear. And if pandemic remains and the duration of lockdowns increase, we expect severe impacts on the firm operations in the following months of 2021. So now I would like to pass the word to Şebnem Kalemli Özcan for our concluding remarks.
Thank you, Sevcan, so much. And I'm joining you from United States, Washington, D.C. So good morning, everyone. If you can put up the slides. Oh, great. I am echoing for some reason. Okay, great. So to conclude, as all my co-authors presented clearly, these results are very important because our results and the paper makes the economic case for global vaccination on top of the moral case. As I'm sure all of you been following this vaccine debate since the news that vaccines are found and effective since last year, end of last year, December 2020, it was always about morals and ethics. The debate was we have a moral responsibility to distribute vaccines in an equitable sense globally. It is an ethical responsibility. So our work changed this debate, basically saying, look, there is also an economic case to be made here. It's not just an act of charity. It is not just an ethical and moral responsibility. It is in the self-interest of rich countries, basically. It is best action, optimizing economic action for advanced economies to invest in increasing the production, increasing the supply, increasing distribution of the vaccines, and to make sure that there is an equitable global vaccine distribution. So the costs speak for themselves, as my co-authors demonstrated. Depending on the scenarios, the global cost of not vaccinating all the countries can vary from 1 to 6 trillion, which is again something in multiples of the investment needed in the COVAX initiative. And this 1 to 6 trillion actually mostly is going to be covered by advanced economies. Even the lowest case scenario, 13% is going to be covered by advanced economies, where in the 6 trillion case, 49% is going to be covered by advanced economies. So again, I think what is going on since the start of this pandemic is we are always behind and the virus is ahead, and we learn to hope for the best. Of course, we have to be optimistic, but we have to prepare for the worst. So it is urgent that advanced economies come together with multilateral international institutions to ensure an equitable global vaccine distribution. Next slide, please. So the potential loss to the advanced economies, as I said, is larger than the money needed in COVAX. And so these type of investments are in the best interest of advanced economies. Again, I cannot say this enough, because this is not about being charitable. This is not about a moral obligation. This is going to be something that will maximize economic well-being of the advanced economies. Now here, we would like to make sure our message is clear. So we are not saying every country go ahead and give 10% of their vaccines right now to another country, because we understand this is not realistic. This is not going to be politically feasible to say in a country, let me vaccinate all my doctors and old people and give the rest to Kenya or Ghana. So we know that this is not going to happen. What we are pushing is increased supply and increased distribution, increased production. This can happen. We achieved this in HIV/AIDS by licensing and producing generic versions of the drug. Same things can be done with the vaccines. And here's the importance of government interventions, because the vaccine companies are not going to do this by themselves. So governments of advanced countries has to intervene. And the recent example of the Johnson & Johnson and Merck partnership, obviously introduced and basically made happen by the Biden administration, is a very good example. So this has to be done at the global level, at the G20 level, bringing in WHO, WTO, IMF, World Bank, all these institutions, and a true multilateral approach should be adopted so that vaccines are going to be produced in a very fast way that is going to be enough for the world population, and also distributed in an efficient way very quickly, because there's also the problem of variants and mutation. And if we are not quick enough here, it is going to be, again, back to the same old story. We are behind, and then the pandemic is ahead of us. So we want to repeat our motto, right? What we show is, given the extent of globalization, we do live in a globalized world. No economy fully recovers until every economy recovers. So it is actually delusional to think that we can just vaccinate one country, open our restaurants, gyms, museums, shopping malls, and be done with it. This is not going to be the case. This will never happen, right? I mean, the virus is going to come back to your country. And you are going to, even you close your country to travel, you are going to have these economic loss through trade and production network, as we clearly demonstrated in our paper. So a multilateral approach is a must to solve this pandemic. And after saying this, I would like to conclude by thanking all my co-authors. This was a lot of fun and excitement to work on this paper. I would like to thank TÜSİAD to host us today, and of course, I would like to thank ICC to fund our study, and to all of you to come and listen today on our important research results. Thank you very much.